Now, a judicial panel investigating claims of police brutality and the shooting of protesters in Nigeria continues to hear evidence in Lagos following the country's biggest upheaval in 20 years. Many believe to be the lower temperature in the country. To lower the temperature in the country, the government needs to move quickly to investigate wrongdoing by security agencies and initiate far-reaching police reforms, whilst also giving victims the justice that they deserve. Let's go now live to Abuja, where we're joined via Zoom by International Crisis Group's Senior Advisor on Nigeria, Mr. Nnamdi Obasi. Thanks so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, so how did Nigeria get from a march against police brutality to one of its biggest crises in decades?
Yes, you're right. It started as a very orderly march against police brutality. But then as time went on, first of all, the police reacted to some of the protesters in a very forceful way, trying to disperse them. And that, further incensed the protesters. And then in some places, the protesters were attacked by thugs and hoodlums, who then created a more violent situation. But then just as that was dying down, we now had a huge surge of people taking laws into their hands, vandalizing property, looting stores, burning down police stations, and so on. And that has then become, that then became the bigger issue, in fact, than the EndSARS campaign. But that's not to say we're losing sight of the pressure for police reform. But in the immediate situation, there's been a challenge in trying to contain and stop the lawlessness.
When you hear the voices of the young people on the streets, it went beyond just police reform. It almost started to sound like they just wanted a better life. They were unhappy with the way that government was running the country. There were so many issues that came out. Could it be that the police issue was more a catalyst of bigger angst, rather?
I think there were two tendencies in the movement. There are two tendencies in the movement. There is one that says focus on police reform and achieve that goal first before we go to other things. But as you rightly said, the failure of the policing, the brutality, the corruption, the extortion, and so on, then became like a symptom of a wider problem with government as a whole. And certainly some people saw this as an opportunity to push for reforms in various other areas about improving livelihoods, creating jobs, improving social services, and ending corruption. So there was certainly a group within the movement that thought this could be used to push for wider reforms.
Some say that the president didn't help the situation because the language he used didn't seem to be sympathetic to the cause, and more than that, he seemed to side with the security forces.
Yes, there's always a tendency, it's not just this government, but historically governments in Nigeria side with security forces, so that wasn't exactly surprising. But then he also said that to the young people, we have heard you loud and clear. We felt he didn't show sufficient empathy for loss of lives and property and so on. But there's certainly a sense in which the government responded. It scrapped the police unit, and it agreed to 5 demands that the protesters had made about police reform, compensation and redress for victims, and so on and so forth. So from the government point of view, they think they responded, but many of the protesters don't think that that was sufficient.
What are the chances that soldiers, if it was them that did it, will actually be brought to book over this issue?
We've had all the assurances from the government that people who acted lawlessly, and not just the soldiers, everyone who acted lawlessly in this circumstance, will be sanctioned. But then the precedents are not very inspiring. We have had cases in which soldiers brutalized and violated people, including extrajudicial killings, and commissions, especially in the case with the Zaria issue with the Shiites in 2015. The commission recommended that some officers should be prosecuted, and they haven't been prosecuted till today. So again, we will have to keep up the pressure when the judicial panels finish their work to make sure that we go from the indictment of officers or any other person who acted lawlessly, we go from indictment to prosecution.
All right, so, I don't want to say this, but I do believe it's true, that for a lot of governments across the continent, the presidents serve at the pleasure of the military. Is it feasible for a president to go after the military, especially in a country like Nigeria, where it wasn't that long ago when the military was the government?
Well, first of all, the military at this point is not a challenge to the government, and particularly because the president himself is a former military person, so he, as commander-in-chief, can carry out sanctions against the military if they are provided enough grounds, to do that. It's a question of will. In some of his earlier broadcasts, he had said the military will be made accountable for abuses, but then we're waiting to see how this plays out.
Is there a fear that this kind of tension, left unchecked, can move into other areas like ethnic tensions, this whole north-south divide scenario?
Well, we've had, especially on social media, certain comments that are not very helpful that tend to divide the issue along along regional lines. But certainly Nigerians in all parts of the country feel that the police should be more accountable, and that we deserve better policing, countrywide. There's a little difference between the North and the South because the predatory behavior by the police has been a lot more pronounced in the South. And then the North also is facing very serious security challenges, and therefore expects a more muscular kind of police response to those security challenges. So those are the kind of differences, but I don't think it's breaking the country along regional lines.
If the president doesn't follow through, will the youth go back to the streets?
It's not clear what they would do, but for now, there is not a likelihood of going back to the streets. They would have to wait and see. And some of these processes are going to take time. The investigation by the judicial panels, will take time. The processes of police reform will take time, and so on. Much depends on how the police itself, conducts itself, how officers conduct themselves. If there is evidence of continuing brutalization, continuing violation of people, of no attempt to change from the behaviors of the past to a more humane kind of policing, then that could also trigger a new wave of protests.
You don't think that things could be covered up? I mean, the events of this past week or so, people were shot at Lekki by people in uniform. The army said they weren't even there. And then later on this week, they say, we were sent by the Lagos governor, but we didn't shoot anybody. And so it starts to become difficult to believe where the first statement says we weren't even there, and then all of a sudden, okay, we were there, but we didn't shoot anybody. We were sent by the governor. Governor denies this. How do we make sense of all of this if you can't believe the army or you doubt the governor?
Well, first of all, yes, there are fears of a cover-up. There are a lot of questions that need to be answered that haven't yet been answered. The government itself and the military included have sometimes also covered up in the past. And so going by those precedents, people are worried and concerned that they might try to do the same thing now. But it's extremely important for the military and the government to come very, very clear about this. If it is military officers military personnel that did the shooting, then they should be sanctioned in a manner that satisfies people, that gives a sense of redress to victims and so on. If it is not the military, that is also a very concerning situation where people can put on military uniforms, take on a military vehicle, drive through a town and go and attack protesters and then go away, and nobody is able to account for that. That's also a very big question mark on the state of security. So either way it goes, there is need for a great deal of clarity about what happened.